They laughed when she walked into the lecture hall, just a cleaning lady in a gray cardigan. But 10 minutes later, she rewrote a Harvard professor's equation, and history watched in silence. They say Harvard's lecture halls have seen everything: brilliance, breakdowns, the birth of theories that reshaped the world. But no one expected that afternoon's breakthrough to come not from a Nobel candidate, nor a tenured academic, but from a quiet woman in a gray cardigan, sitting alone in the very last row. Grace Whittaker didn't look like she belonged there. Not to the sharp-eyed students clutching their MacBooks, not to the suited faculty murmuring in Latin-rooted whispers, and certainly not to Dr. Edwin Roth, Harvard's most formidable mind in applied mathematics, a man who could reduce doctoral candidates to silence with a single arched brow. Grace, 37, didn't have a PhD. She didn't even have a Harvard ID badge. What she had was a worn notebook tucked under her arm, filled with years of numbers written in pencil and hope. She found a seat in the back, careful not to make noise. The walls around her smelled of chalk dust and history. She smoothed the sleeves of her cardigan, the same one she wore when mopping the library's marble floors. From here, no one would recognize her as the cleaning staff. That suited her just fine. At the front of the hall, Dr. Roth adjusted his cufflinks and cleared his throat. "Today," he said, "we explore what has stumped minds for decades. A reformulation of the von Ebers conundrum with implications for post-quantum encryption." Murmurs filled the hall. To most of the audience, it was thrilling. To Grace, it was familiar. Painfully so. She'd spent 3 winters poring over that very equation at night, balancing textbooks on laundry baskets, her daughter asleep in the next room. But this wasn't her place to speak. She'd learned to hide brilliance behind silence. Brilliance makes people uncomfortable, especially when it wears cleaning shoes. As Roth began sketching the equation across the blackboard, Grace's heart stirred. The numbers weren't abstract to her. They were music, each variable a note, each operation a rhythm. The math wasn't just difficult, it was beautiful, yet she stayed silent. Until Roth made a transformation on the board. It was nearly correct. Elegant, but incomplete. Grace blinked, her fingers curled around her pencil. She had seen this before, late one night at MIT's public archives. The transformation only worked under very specific boundary conditions. Otherwise, it introduced a hidden inconsistency. She looked around. No one raised a hand. And then, as if her arm belonged to someone braver, her hand lifted into the air. There was a pause. Heads turned. Laughter flickered at the edges of the room. Dr. Roth squinted into the crowd. "Yes," he said, a razor-thin smile stretching across his lips. Grace stood, hesitant but steady. "I was wondering about the variable transformation in Step 4, she said. "Wouldn't that violate the boundary constraint under a nonlinear system?" There was silence, the kind that hangs in cathedrals, or courtrooms, or execution chambers. Roth tilted his head. "Your name?" "Grace Whittaker." "And your department?" Grace's voice didn't waver. "I'm not with any department. I work, in facilities." A few chuckles broke out. Roth raised a single silver eyebrow. "Facilities," he repeated. "And you believe you found a flaw in my derivation?" Grace swallowed hard. "Not a flaw exactly, just a potential inconsistency." Someone in the third row muttered, "This is going to be good." Dr. Roth's expression tightened. "Well then," he said smoothly, "if you're confident in your assessment, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate it on the board." The challenge was clear. A public stage. A room full of skeptics. A woman with no credentials, no titles, no allies. Grace's legs felt like stone. She could feel every eye on her, the dismissive ones, the entertained ones, the ones that had never even seen her before despite walking past her in the hallway. But somewhere beneath the humiliation, beneath the cardigan and the quiet demeanor, something flickered. She stepped forward. Her shoes echoed against the wooden floor like gunshots in a courtroom. Each step felt like dragging a lifetime of invisibility toward the light. Dr. Roth stepped aside. The board loomed large. The chalk trembled slightly in her fingers. She took a breath. Numbers danced behind her eyelids. This was her world. This was where shame had no voice. And then she wrote, not timidly, not hesitantly, but with certainty, with memory, with the clarity of someone who had lived inside the equation far longer than anyone in that room suspected. For 30 seconds, the room was a vacuum, and then gasps, a murmur, then silence again. Dr. Roth stepped forward, staring at the board. What he saw wasn't just correct, it was concise, it was beautiful. He cleared his throat. That is one interpretation, he said stiffly. Someone snorted. Another student whispered, "She just schooled Roth." But Grace didn't smile. She didn't look smug. She just returned to her seat, notebook hugged to her chest, heart thundering. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, the woman in the back row, the hand that dared to rise, was the beginning of everything. The story would spread, across halls, across departments, across campuses. But for now, she sat still, the chalk dust still clinging to her fingers like proof of something quietly revolutionary. She wasn't just solving math. She was rewriting the way people looked at her. There was a tension in the room, heavy like storm clouds just before the sky splits open. Grace could feel it pressing down on her chest as she sat back in her seat. The chalk dust still lingered on her fingers, faint white lines against skin worn from mopping marble, not solving equations. She hadn't planned on speaking. She hadn't even planned on staying long. But the moment her chalk touched the board, something inside her unlocked, like an old melody remembered after decades of silence. It wasn't just a math, it was her place in it. For the first time in years, the numbers weren't just her refuge, they were her voice. And she had just spoken loud enough for Harvard to hear. Dr. Edwin Roth, still standing near the board, stared at Grace with an unreadable expression. The applause hadn't come. Not yet. Only murmurs, suspicion, curiosity, and something else, unease. He smoothed his tie, then turned back to the chalkboard with a flourish. "Well," he said, voice cool, "perhaps Ms. Whitaker would care to try something more current." Grace's heart clenched. He wasn't done. She had passed the first test. But now came the real one, the kind not found in textbooks, the kind not taught but guarded. Roth wiped the board clean with 3 sharp swipes and wrote a new equation. The symbols were foreign to most in the room, dense with notation, unfamiliar even to some of the graduate students. He turned slightly, addressing the room. "This," he said, "is a formulation I've been working on in relation to post-quantum encryption. It has not yet been published." Then, pointedly, "Ms. Whitaker, if you're not too weary from your earlier performance—" It wasn't an invitation. It was a gauntlet. A quiet voice behind Grace whispered, "She's gonna freeze." Another, "She's out of her depth now." Grace didn't move. The equation on the board might as well have been written in a different language. It used transformations she hadn't seen, symbols that looked more like whispers between experts than anything in the books she had borrowed from the public library. She stared at it. and for the first time in the past hour, felt fear. Not fear of being wrong. Fear of confirming what the room wanted to believe. She rose slowly, every muscle heavy. Her walk to the front felt longer than before. The board loomed again, but this time, it didn't welcome her. It warned her. She held the chalk, stared at the mess of symbols, and for a full 15 seconds, did nothing. Her mind raced. She thought of her daughter, Emily, working an extra shift at the diner so they could pay for car insurance. She thought of the nights she stayed up rereading number theory, scribbling proofs on napkins between loads of laundry. She wasn't supposed to be here, and yet, here she was. "I understand," Roth said, starting forward. "There's no shame in returning to your seat." Grace didn't move. Somewhere in the dust of memory, she recalled an article she had read on a public computer with time ticking down on her 30-minute library session. It had been dense, nearly unreadable, but something in it had stuck with her. She looked at the equation again, and suddenly, it wasn't chaos. It was pattern. She stepped closer, whispered to herself, "Wait." And then she began to write. First slowly, then with greater confidence. Behind her, the room hushed. Even Roth leaned slightly forward. What she did wasn't just accurate. It was different. She wasn't solving it the way any of them would. She was seeing it. One transformation, pause, another substitution, pause. Her brow furrowed, then cleared. Her mind flowed in a rhythm born not of academic training, but of pure, intuitive genius. Dr. Margaret Ellison, seated in the front row, didn't speak, but her eyes lit with recognition. "She's collapsing the variable field," Ellison whispered to a colleague. "That's not in any published paper." Grace reached a step in the equation where things didn't line up. She froze, fingers gripped tight on the chalk. Roth's smirk returned, but then, like watching dominoes fall in reverse, she saw the mistake. Not hers. His. The entire problem, Roth had written, carried an inefficiency. She gently erased 2 symbols and wrote a sequence so elegant, so refined, that even Ellison gasped. "She's improving it," Ellison said. "Edwin, she's rewriting your work." Roth's face drained of color. It was like watching a locked door swing open in real time. By the time Grace placed the final mark, the chalkboard looked transformed. Not just solved, but clarified, optimized. She stepped back. Her hand was steady now. Dr. Roth approached the board, stared, then turned. "Where?" he asked, his voice almost soft. "Did you learn this?" Grace looked at him. Not with defiance, not with pride, just truth. "I didn't learn it," she said. "I saw it." He blinked. "You saw it?" She nodded once. Dr. Ellison rose. Her voice rang clear. "That last step, it mirrors the Takahashi reduction, but more refined. Grace, do you know the name Takahashi?" Grace shook her head. "No, ma'am." There was a pause, a breath, and then Dr. Ellison turned to the room. "To everyone present," she said, "please remember this day. You've just witnessed something I haven't seen in 30 years of mathematics." No applause. Not yet. The awe was too fresh. Dr. Roth stepped back, defeated but transformed, not by the loss of face, but by the recognition of something he hadn't expected to find in a woman with no degree, no title, no desk in the faculty hall. Only a mind and a will sharp enough to rewrite his own. Grace looked down at the chalk still in her hand. She didn't feel like the cleaning woman anymore. She felt seen, and it terrified her just as much as it thrilled her. They hadn't asked where she came from. They only asked how she did it. In the hours after Grace Whittaker solved not 1, but 2 equations that had left most of Harvard speechless, the lecture hall buzzed with questions, muttered, curious, urgent. She'd left the room quietly, her notebook hugged to her chest like a life vest. No applause, no handshakes, just stares, whispered disbelief. And yet that night, long after the janitorial shift ended and the last lecture light was dimmed, Grace returned. Not to the board, but to the back corner of Widener Library, where forgotten books lined dusted shelves, and no one asked if you belonged. She sat cross-legged on the floor with a thermos of lukewarm tea and pulled out the object no one else had seen. The thing that had traveled with her for years through bus rides, break rooms, and midnight silences. A blue spiral-bound notebook, edges frayed, spine taped. Its cover read in fading pen. Solutions no one asked for. It wasn't just one notebook. It was the third in a growing stack. The first had begun 10 years ago, the night her ex-husband walked out. Emily, barely 4 at the time, had cried herself to sleep, and Grace had done what she always did when the world didn't make sense. She turned to numbers. They didn't yell. They didn't lie. They didn't leave. She'd borrowed textbooks from a thrift store 2 blocks from her old apartment in Dorchester. Sometimes missing pages, sometimes water-stained, but still sacred. Theorems became lullabies, proofs became prayers. She wrote in the margins with dollar store pens and solved problems no one assigned. By the time Emily turned 6, Grace could replicate second-year college coursework. By 9, she was tackling group theory in stolen hours after night shifts. She never spoke of it. The world didn't reward people like her for thinking outside their station. It punished them for daring to believe they could rise above it. But now, someone had noticed. Earlier that afternoon, after the symposium, as Grace slipped through the corridor hoping to vanish, a voice had stopped her. Ms. Whitaker. It was Dr. Margaret Ellison, her heels sharp against the marble floor, but her tone gentle. "I'd like to see your notes." Grace had frozen. "They're nothing," she'd said quickly. "Just personal work." That personal work rewrote Roth's equation. Dr. Ellison didn't ask again. She simply handed Grace her card. "Tomorrow. My office, 10 o'clock. Now, alone in the library, Grace stared at the notebooks spread before her. Her fingers hovered over a page labeled Hypothesis, Prime Gaps in Restricted Modular Fields. It was a mess of symbols, margin notes, and odd little arrows. To her, it was music. To the rest of the world, it was invisible. She flipped to the next page, a system for compressing multidimensional data sets, an idea born from watching soap bubbles in Emily's science kit. Another page, a recursive encryption model using Fibonacci limits. She had written that one during a week Emily had the flu, and Grace had sat beside her bed, calculating between cold compresses and cartoons. No one had seen these pages, not even Emily. Grace blinked hard, then pulled the notebooks together and slid them into her old canvas tote. As she left the library, the campus was wrapped in midnight silence. Statues of white men stood tall in the darkness, as if judging every step she took. But Grace didn't walk like she used to. Something in her shoulders had lifted. The next morning, she stood outside Dr. Ellison's office at MIT. The door was open. The desk was clean, but the walls were lined with framed Arnold articles, equations written in ink and history. Dr. Ellison looked up and smiled. "You brought them." Grace nodded, holding the notebooks close like they might crumble if anyone else touched them. She sat. The first few pages passed in silence. Then, "Where did you learn this transformation?" Ellison asked, tapping the page. "I didn't," Grace said. "I saw it in a symmetry problem from an old textbook, but it didn't quite fit. So I changed it." Ellison blinked. "You changed a symmetry group transformation." Grace nodded, unsure if that was good or very, very bad. By the 5th page, Ellison was silent. Her hands had stopped turning. By the 7th, she called in another professor. By the 10th, 2 more had gathered. whispering in low tones behind her. Grace sat very still. She wasn't dressed for a meeting like this. Her cardigan had a tear under the sleeve. Her shoes still had bleach stains, but they weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at what she saw. Dr. Ellison finally turned back to her. "Have you ever submitted any of this to a journal?" Grace shook her head. "I wouldn't even know how." Ellison leaned back in her chair. "You've independently developed methods we've only just begun to test, and some we haven't even thought of yet." "I just try things," Grace said quietly. Ellison looked at her a long moment. "You don't try. You see, that's rare. That's unteachable." There was silence. Then, "Grace, would you consider working with us formally? A research assistant position, maybe more. We can sponsor a late-entry fellowship. It won't be easy, but I believe it would be worth it." Grace blinked. A job? At MIT? She thought of Emily again, of all the nights her daughter had kissed her forehead and said, "One day, Mom, one day someone will see what I already do." Maybe this was that day. Grace took a breath. "I'll have to ask the babysitter if she can do more mornings," she said softly. Ellison smiled. "We'll make it work." Outside, Grace sat on a campus bench beneath a sycamore tree. The sky had cleared. She opened her notebook again, and for the first time in 10 years, she wrote not in pencil, she wrote in pen, because some solutions, they weren't meant to be erased anymore. Emily Whitaker had learned early how to read her mother's silences, the way her shoulders tensed before opening another unpaid bill, the slight tilt of her head when math books were mentioned on TV, the soft smile that always came, not quite happy, not quite sad, when someone asked, "So what do you do?" Growing up, Emily didn't think her mother was like other moms. Other moms baked cookies. Hers calculated ratios on the back of grocery receipts. Other moms cleaned to music. Hers cleaned to the sound of narrated calculus lectures played at 0.8x speed. Other moms sat on bleachers at soccer games. Hers stood outside the fence with bleach on her shoes, too proud to sit in the parents' section in her work uniform. And yet, Emily never once thought her mother was less. If anything, she knew early on that the world didn't deserve how brilliant her mother was. She remembered one rainy Tuesday when she was 12. Their electricity had been cut again. Grace had lit a candle and, instead of cursing or crying, pulled out a dusty textbook from the Salvation Army shelf. "I'll show you how to solve for infinity," she said, smiling in the candlelight. Emily had no idea what that meant, but the warmth in her mother's voice made her believe they'd be okay. Now, at 19, Emily worked part-time at a diner, saving every tip for tuition. She'd been accepted into the local community college's engineering track. Not MIT, not Harvard, but it was a start. That's why the call from her babysitter yesterday caught her completely off guard. "Your mom didn't come home," the sitter said. "She left her uniform. Just didn't show up." Emily's heart dropped. Was she sick? Did she collapse from exhaustion? She called, texted. No response. Then, at 8:42 p.m., a message came through. "I'll explain tomorrow. I promise. I did something brave today." Emily reread it a dozen times. Brave? Her mother was the definition of brave, but that word, it carried a different weight tonight. The next morning, Emily caught a bus to Cambridge and waited outside Widener Library. And that's when she saw her. Her mother, in the same gray cardigan, yes, but with something Emily hadn't seen in years, a different walk. Not tired, not apologetic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emily saw it in the way Grace held her bag tighter, straighter, the way she looked up at the campus buildings, not with envy, but with belonging. Emily ran to her, breathless. "Mom!" Grace turned. Her face lit up, but then softened with guilt. "I was going to tell you everything tonight." "You scared me," Emily said. "What happened?" Grace hesitated. Then, with the gentleness of someone unwrapping something fragile, she said, "I solved something." Emily blinked. "What do you mean?" "I spoke up at Harvard," Grace said. "I solved Roth's equation, then another. Now they want my notebooks." Emily stared. "Wait, Dr. Roth? Harvard Roth?" Grace nodded slowly. "Dr. Ellison from MIT, too. They think I might be able to contribute." Formally, Emily sat on the bench behind them. Her hands shook. "I knew it," she whispered. "I always knew it." Grace frowned, unsure. Emily looked up, eyes glossy. "You remember the journal I kept when I was little?" Grace smiled. "The purple one with the glitter sticker?" "I wrote about you," Emily said. "I said my mom's the smartest person alive. I said one day the world will notice." Grace sat beside her. They didn't speak for a moment. Only the wind answered, soft through the sycamore branches. That night, back at their apartment, Grace opened her closet and pulled down a box Emily hadn't seen in years. Inside were the first two notebooks, the ones from the very beginning. Some pages had crayon doodles in the margins, Emily's back when she was 5. Some had food stains. Others smelled faintly of pine sol. Grace placed them in Emily's lap. "These are yours now." Emily opened one and stared at the pages. Symbols, sketches, full-page equations written in quiet desperation and fierce hope. "These," Grace said, "are the hours I wasn't with you." But they weren't wasted. I was building something. Emily nodded, tears silently falling. "I know." Grace took her daughter's hand. "You were always the reason I didn't stop." The next morning, Grace and Emily walked together onto the Harvard campus, not as cleaner and child, but as mathematician and witness. Students whispered, some pointed, but this time, Grace didn't shrink. She looked up at the clock tower and said softly, "Let's go be who we were meant to be." MIT's Building 2 didn't look like a place where lives were rewritten. It looked quiet, modest, just another glass-paneled structure along the Charles River. But on the third floor, in a room with no windows and a long walnut table, Grace Whitaker was about to be offered a future she never dared imagine. She held her canvas tote tightly, the one with frayed straps and 3 spiral notebooks inside. Her cardigan had been carefully mended. Her hair was pulled back, but her palms still trembled. Across the table sat Dr. Margaret Ellison, joined now by 2 senior members of the Applied Mathematics Department and 1 man from MIT's Center for Quantum Research. His name tag read, Dr. Leo Ashcroft. His tie was crooked, but his eyes were sharp. Ellison spoke first. "Grace, thank you for coming." Grace nodded once. "Thank you for inviting me." There was a pause. Then Ashcroft leaned forward. "We've reviewed your notes, all 3 notebooks." He tapped the top of a folder in front of him. "In particular," he said, "your expansion on recursive primes applied to encryption keys is ahead of where we currently are. And your transformation on the Takahashi matrix? It's elegant, better than what we published last quarter." Grace blinked. "It was just an idea." Ashcroft smiled. "Ideas don't solve 20-year-old barriers in 3 pages. Genius does." Grace looked down. She wasn't used to being called that word, not in daylight, not in boardrooms. Dr. Ellison took over. Her tone softened. "Grace, we'd like to offer you a formal visiting research position at MIT's Center for Advanced Mathematics. It comes with a stipend, housing support, and access to all campus resources." Grace's throat tightened. "That sounds like more than I'm qualified for," she whispered. "No," Ellison said, firm. "It's exactly what you're qualified for. What you've always been qualified for. The world just didn't know where to look." One of the other professors, a gray-haired man with tortoise-shell glasses, added, "We'll file the exemption paperwork. We've done this before for exceptional cases. You'll be working under Dr. Ellison's mentorship." Eventually, if you're willing, we'd like you to publish formally. Grace's breath caught. Publish? Her name? In a journal? Something tightened in her chest. Not fear, but the kind of joy too big to hold. She swallowed. I don't have a degree or credentials. Ashcroft leaned back, his eyes kind. Grace, no one in this room cares what pieces of paper you don't have. What we care about is the mind behind those pages. Ellison nodded. And the courage it took to stand in that Harvard lecture hall and say, I see something different. That was your application. There was silence. Grace looked down at her tote bag, then slowly pulled one of the notebooks out. The oldest one. The one with the torn corner and her daughter's crayon doodles in the margins. She placed it gently on the table. If I say yes, I want to keep using this, she said quietly. Not a laptop, not at first. This is where it all lives. Ellison smiled. Then this notebook becomes part of our history. A pause. Then Grace whispered, Yes, I'd like to try. And with that, the room seemed to exhale. The tension dissolved into soft smiles and quiet celebration. That evening, Grace and Emily stood on the steps outside MIT's dome. Emily had brought a plastic bag of takeout, turkey sandwiches and chips. She'd insisted they eat together under the open sky. You said yes, Emily whispered, still wide-eyed. I said yes, Grace echoed. They sat side by side, unwrapping sandwiches, watching boats drift on the Charles. There were no trumpets, no applause, just a woman and her daughter, and the quiet beginning of a life that had always lived in the shadows, now stepping into light. I'm proud of you, Mom, Emily said. Grace looked at her, smiling. Funny. I've spent my whole life hoping you'd be proud. You didn't have to wait this long, Emily replied. I always was. 6 months later, a quiet announcement appeared on MIT's research newsletter. The Whittaker model, an innovative approach to prime field compression and post-quantum encryption, was presented today by visiting researcher Grace Whittaker. The name was short, the applause in the room polite, but in one corner of the auditorium, a young woman sat filming the presentation on her phone, her eyes full of tears. Because she knew what most didn't, that behind that title, researcher, stood 1,000 hours of unrecognized genius, a decade of late-night tears, and a mother who had once whispered proofs to herself in the dark. The world had finally noticed. But Emily? She'd always known MIT's building. 32 wasn't where revolutions were supposed to begin. It was beige, quiet, slightly too cold. But on the 3rd floor, in a lab lined with whiteboards and fluorescent light, Grace Whittaker was rewriting the future of encryption, armed with nothing more than a red marker and 3 decades of silent thinking. At 8:10 a.m., the room was empty except for her. She stood in front of the board barefoot, shoes off, sleeves pushed up. Her notebook, creased, dog-eared, sacred, lay open on the desk behind her. She didn't need it today. What was coming had been living in her head for years. Across the room, a postdoc named Jalen had paused mid-coffee sip to watch. He whispered to a colleague, "She hasn't stopped moving since 6. Grace muttered to herself as she worked, "If primes can nest in self-referential space, then the gaps aren't noise. They're structure." She circled one term, drew a line to another, then backed up and paused. Then, without warning, she erased the entire board. Jalen flinched. "What is she doing?" Grace turned to a second board, started again, slower this time. This wasn't just a derivation. It was a conversation. Between her and the numbers, between intuition and logic, between the hundreds of silent hours she'd once spent solving problems by candlelight, and now the world's most advanced mathematical tools. By 9:12, the room was no longer empty. 6 researchers stood quietly along the wall, notebooks closed, eyes wide. They'd heard rumors. The janitor who rewrote Roth. Some scoffed. Some came to watch her fail. But what they saw instead was different. Grace didn't just write equations. She revealed them, as if the numbers had been waiting for her to translate them all along. By 10 o'clock, Dr. Margaret Ellison arrived. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, watching her protege construct a prime gap matrix using a method no one had ever published. "Grace," she said gently, "what are you building?" Grace stepped back. Her hand was trembling, but not from fear, from recognition, from arrival. "I think it's a compression model," she said softly. "A new one." Ellison walked closer, examined the board, her brows furrowed. "This eliminates 4 steps," she whispered. "Grace, this is Whittaker's reduction." Grace blinked. "That's not a real term." Ellison smiled. "It is now." That afternoon, Grace was asked to explain the model to a panel from the Quantum Encryption Lab. 10 professors, 1 board, 1 woman. The room was full. Her voice shook at first. Her hands, too. She'd practiced this presentation with Emily the night before, pacing their small apartment while her daughter timed her and corrected her metaphors. But here, now, before 10 of the world's sharpest minds, Grace didn't stumble. She built the model from the ground up, explaining how the gaps between non-linear primes weren't useless, but predictive. How the irregularities she'd once noticed in a borrowed textbook's appendix were actually gateways to compression. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Dr. Leo Ashcroft stood up. He turned to the rest of the room and said, "This isn't just innovative, it's dangerous." Gasps. He looked at Grace. "Not because it's wrong, because it works. And if this scales, if this gets into the wrong hands, it could break most quantum encryption systems we thought were secure until 2080 Grace's knees nearly buckled. She'd just been trying to solve a riddle, not start a revolution." That night, Grace and Emily sat by the window in their new campus. Housing, just a 1-bedroom, but bright, safe, and close to the labs. Emily was silent for a long time. Then, "You invented something real, didn't you?" Grace nodded slowly. "I think I did." Emily leaned against her shoulder. "Do you remember that time in middle school," she said, "when I said you'd build something no one else could see?" Grace laughed, eyes misty. "You also said I'd own a flying car and live in a castle." "Well," Emily smiled, 2 out of 3's not bad." They sat like that until the city lights flickered on, the skyline buzzing softly in the distance. Tomorrow would bring meetings, security clearances, the start of peer review. But tonight, a former cleaning lady was being called a mathematician, not by accident, not by pity, but because she saw something no one else did, and proved it. The stage was too big, the lights too bright, and the name on the giant screen, Grace Whittaker, MIT visiting researcher, still felt like it belonged to someone else. Grace stood just behind the curtain at the International Symposium on Mathematical Frontiers, held this year in Geneva. Her hands trembled as she clutched a copy of her slides. A tech assistant whispered, "You'll have 12 minutes. Timer starts when you begin." Grace nodded. Across the velvet curtain, a sea of chairs stretched endlessly. Hundreds of mathematicians, researchers, skeptics, all gathered to hear breakthroughs and to judge them. Behind her, Dr. Margaret Ellison gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to be anyone but who you already are," she whispered. "That's more than enough." Grace smiled faintly, the way you smile when your lungs are tight and your knees don't quite belong to you. And then the announcer's voice boomed. "Our next speaker is Grace Whittaker, whose recent work at MIT on prime gap reduction and modular compression has challenged traditional encryption models. Please welcome..." She stepped out before the applause could start. It didn't, just murmurs. Some leaned forward in confusion. Others blinked as if waiting for someone to correct a mistake. Because what they saw wasn't a PhD in a crisp suit. It was a woman in a simple navy dress and soft gray cardigan, walking like someone who wasn't sure she'd be allowed to stay. Grace stood at the podium, cleared her throat, clicked to slide one. "I never meant to be here," she began, her voice calm but real. "My journey started with a crayon and a calculator. My daughter was sick. The rent was late. But I saw something in numbers that made sense when nothing else did." There was a hush. She moved to the next slide. "Today I want to share with you what I call Whittaker compression. It began with a mistake in a donated textbook and ended with this." The model appeared, beautiful, stark, unexpectedly elegant. Some in the crowd leaned forward, others scoffed, quiet but sharp. One man near the front crossed his arms, and then came the moment no one had planned for. A hand shot up. From the second row, it was Dr. Andrei Kovac, the Romanian theorist whose own model had dominated encryption theory for the last decade. He stood abruptly, interrupting the presentation. "This approach violates postulate 2 of the Takahashi theorem," he said flatly. "It cannot hold under recursive transformation." Gasps. The moderator rose, attempting to interject. But Grace didn't flinch. She stepped from behind the podium, walked slowly to the whiteboard to her left, picked up a marker, and rewrote her proof from memory, adjusting it in real time, folding in Kovac's postulate, not avoiding it, but absorbing it. Each step was deliberate, fluid, controlled. She was not defending her model, she was expanding it. By the end, even Kovac had sat down, and when she turned around, chalk in hand, the room was silent. Then Dr. Ellison stood up, and she clapped. Once, twice, a third time, until the room followed. A standing ovation from the world's most skeptical audience. Not because of her title, not because of her affiliation, but because she had shown them a piece of mathematics that had been hiding in plain sight, and only someone who'd never been invited to the table could have seen it from the outside. Afterward, Grace stood outside under the Geneva sky. Her name tag fluttered in the breeze. Emily called. Grace answered, her voice breathless. They stood, Em. They all stood. Emily didn't say anything at first, then through tears. "I told you." They just needed to catch up to what I always knew. That night, articles flooded academic forums. Untrained researcher stuns symposium with compression breakthrough. The Whittaker model may redefine post-quantum encryption. From cleaning staff to keynote, the woman who rewrote the rules. But Grace didn't read them. She sat on her hotel bed, barefoot, working on her next idea. Because genius wasn't the destination. It was her way of seeing, and the world was finally watching. The letter arrived by courier. No return address. Just one embossed seal, U.S. Department of Defense. Grace opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, a formal invitation to consult on a top-secret encryption initiative. They'd reviewed her Whittaker model. They saw national security implications. They were prepared to offer full clearance, substantial compensation, and relocation options for your family. She sat still for a long time. MIT's office outside buzzed with students and researchers, oblivious to the offer that now sat open on Grace's lap. When Dr. Ellison walked in 20 minutes later, she didn't need to ask. "I take it they found you," she said, sinking into the chair across from her. Grace nodded, the letter still in her hands. "They're offering more money than I've made in my life." Ellison folded her hands. "And what do they want in return?" Grace was silent. They want me to develop a full version of the compression model, exclusive to their systems, full transfer of intellectual property. Ellison's expression darkened. So they want to own it. Own you. Grace stared at her hands, rough from years of bleach and scrubbing. Those hands had never signed a contract, never held a check with more than 4 digits, never belonged in rooms where words like proprietary and non-disclosure floated like perfume. That evening, Grace returned to her apartment. Emily was on the couch, headphones in, laptop open. She was editing a scholarship essay, one about her mother. "Hey," Grace said softly. Emily looked up. "Everything okay?" Grace handed her the letter. Emily read it slowly, then again, then said nothing. Grace sat beside her, watching her daughter read every word. "I thought this was what we wanted," she said. Emily closed the letter gently. "I think you wanted to be heard, not bought." Those 6 words landed heavier than any equation. The next day, MIT called an emergency meeting. The department chair, Ellison, 2 legal advisors, and a representative from a well-known Silicon Valley firm were in the room. Grace entered with her tote bag and her notebooks. The tech rep spoke first. "We're prepared to offer a partnership. Equity, not just salary. Your name will be on the patent. You'll be listed as co-founder." Grace stared at him. "Of what?" "Our new division, focused on algorithmic compression at quantum scale. Your model is years ahead. We want to make it a product." The MIT legal advisor added, "You'd still retain academic freedom, but your work would be tied to this enterprise moving forward." She was being offered everything the academic world prized: title, funding, legacy, and yet, "What about open access?" she asked. "What about education?" They hesitated. The answer was clear. That night, Grace sat on the floor of her apartment surrounded by old notebooks. One in particular caught her eye, the purple one, the one Emily used to doodle in as a child while Grace solved problems on the kitchen floor. She opened it. On the first page, a drawing of Grace holding a calculator. Above her head, "My mom solves stuff nobody gets." Below it, in Emily's shaky handwriting, "One day, the world will listen to her. I hope they listen kindly." Grace closed the notebook and made her decision. The next morning, Grace called a press conference, not for media, but for the MIT community. Students filled the room, professors, journalists, even a few rivals. She stepped up to the microphone with nothing but a piece of paper. "I've been offered things I never dreamed of. Money, titles, power. But I didn't start doing math to get rich. I started because numbers made sense when the world didn't. I won't sell this model to any government or private company. I'm donating it to the open source research archive. Anyone, anywhere in the world can study it, improve it, or use it." The room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then more. By the end, the entire hall stood. Not because she had won anything, but because she had given something no one expected, a gift the world couldn't buy. That night, Grace returned home to find Emily had baked a cake. Badly. It tilted left and had too much frosting. In red icing, it read, "Math Mom greater than millionaire." Grace laughed harder than she had in years. And for the first time, she slept not with fear or hunger or equations spinning in her head, but with peace. It began with a letter, handwritten, no return address, just 3 sentences. "Dear Ms. Whitaker, I live in Montana. I love math, but everyone says it's not for girls like me. How did you keep going? Sophie, age 14. Grace stared at the paper, lips trembling. She'd received academic invitations, press inquiries, even security briefings, but none of them made her knees weak like this did. Because this wasn't just a question, it was a reflection of herself 25 years ago. She wrote back the next day, short, honest. I kept going because the numbers were kind. People weren't, but numbers always were. And because my daughter deserved to see what a woman with an invisible gift could do when she stopped hiding. That was the first. Then came dozens, then hundreds. Some were emails, some folded notes sent in care of MIT, some written in shaky cursive from detention centers, trailer homes, libraries, and towns with no Wi-Fi. And then they started showing up. At first, 1 or 2 a week, girls in mismatched coats, sitting in the hallway outside Grace's research room, holding notebooks like life jackets. A 12-year-old with a stutter who refused to speak until she was shown a whiteboard. A Latina high schooler who took 2 buses just to ask how to apply to college without papers. A teen mother who whispered through tears, "I solve problems at night after my baby sleeps, but I don't know if that counts." Grace looked each one in the eyes, and every time said, "It counts. You count." Emily began coming to the lab more often, not to study, but to help. She made tea for the girls, listened, taught them how to sketch graphs, laughed when they got nervous, sat beside them when the professors walked by too fast to notice them. Soon, MIT gave Grace a small room near her lab. Nothing fancy, just 2 tables, some chairs, and a whiteboard. Grace put up a handwritten sign, "Whitaker Evenings, for any girl who thinks she doesn't belong." It wasn't official, no grades, no funding, no cameras, but every Thursday at 6 p.m., the room filled. And by 6:10, the equations started flowing. Some girls brought only questions, some brought stories, some brought trauma, all brought brilliance. One Thursday, a girl named Jaya arrived from Newark. She had a notebook filled with pages of prime distributions she'd calculated on her own. Grace studied them carefully, then looked up. "Where did you learn to think like this?" Jaya shrugged. "Nowhere. I just see them." Grace smiled. "I used to think I was broken. Now I know we're wired differently." Jaya's eyes lit up. For the first time in her life, she believed it too. That winter, MIT quietly approved the establishment of a small pilot program, WISE, Whitaker Initiative for Silent Excellence. It offered housing and mentorship for girls who didn't fit the traditional pipeline. Girls who were brilliant but poor, or undocumented, or dismissed, or just invisible. Grace didn't want a statue. She wanted a door, one that didn't slam shut when the world saw your shoes before your ideas. At the ribbon cutting, a reporter asked her, "How does it feel to go from janitor to founder?" Grace replied without hesitation, "I was always both." It just took the world time to see. Later that evening, Grace and Emily stood by the door as girls poured into the new center. Laughing, chattering, one hugged a worn-out calculator like it was a teddy bear. Emily turned to her mother and whispered, "This is your real equation." Grace raised an eyebrow. "What's the answer?" Emily smiled. "Hope, multiplied." And for once, Grace didn't correct the math. She just took her daughter's hand and watched the future walk in. The hall seated 3,000 people. It was the largest lecture Grace had ever seen, more than any symposium, bigger than Geneva. This was the World Conference on Human Potential and Technology, held once a decade, broadcast live to 52 countries, watched by presidents, scientists, and children from towns that didn't have libraries, but had dreams. The invitation had come with one simple request: Don't just talk about math. Talk about what math has done to you. Grace stood backstage, a microphone clipped to her collar. Emily sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving her mother. On Grace's lapel was a small pin, a crayon inside a circle of numbers, the new symbol of the WISE program. When the host introduced her, there was a pause. No applause, just breathe. Then she stepped into the light. "My name is Grace Whitaker," she began, her voice calm, clear, grounded. "I'm not here because I have a PhD. I'm not here because I climbed some ladder. I'm here because math kept me alive when nothing else made sense." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I used to mop floors. At night while my daughter slept, I solved equations no one gave me. I wasn't trying to be brilliant. I was trying to stay visible to myself." She paused. "You see, I come from a world where people don't ask you what you think. They ask what you clean, what you earn, what school you didn't go to." A silence settled, not empty, but charged. But math, it didn't care if I had the right shoes. It didn't laugh when I raised my hand. It just waited, patient, quiet, until I was ready to see. Behind her, the screen lit up with images. A cleaning cart next to a chalkboard. A little girl coloring numbers on a floor. A whiteboard filled with equations, and below it, a group of girls smiling in hoodies and headscarves, holding notebooks close to their hearts. I was never the smartest person in the room. I was just the one no one saw, until I stopped, apologizing for taking up space. She walked to the edge of the stage. "So today I want to give you not a theorem, not a solution, but a question." She turned toward the camera. "Who in your world are you not seeing? Who's stacking your plates, parking your car, changing your sheets, and thinking about algorithms while you look past them?" No one moved. No one even blinked. Because I promise you this: the future of innovation doesn't only sit in Ivy League classrooms. It also rides the bus at 5 a.m. It works double shifts. It hides behind silence and shy hands. She closed her notes, looked down at her palms, then up again. Genius is not a spotlight. It's a match in the dark. And if you're lucky enough to find it, don't blow it out. Fan it. When she finished, there was no applause for a moment, just stillness, and then thunder, clapping, cheering, tears. People didn't just stand. They wept. In that moment, Grace Whitaker became more than a mathematician, more than a mother, more than a woman who rose from the basement to the boardroom. She became a symbol, not of intellect, but of what's possible when we stop asking for permission to be extraordinary. That evening, after the crowds dispersed, Grace and Emily sat quietly in a small park across from the venue. Emily reached over and took her mother's hand. "You didn't just change math, Mom." Grace turned to her. "You changed what people believe they're allowed to become." The stars flickered above them, software distant. Grace looked up, and for once she wasn't searching for answers. She was simply, finally, home. The end.